Welcome, class, to week 7 of History 3655, Bubbles, Panics, and Depressions, A World History of Economic Crisis. Okay, so I've corrected your exams, and this week we're going to be working on uh, economic crises in 19th century America. The reason why this is significant is because these economic crises begin to take on characteristics of modern economic crises, which are international in scope, which involve a clear business cycle. We'll talk about that in a second. And so they have some characteristics that are similar to economic crises we have today. So, okay. Now, let's talk about the business cycle. In the early 20th century, Joseph Schumpeter, who's a well-known Austrian economist, argued that modern economic crises were actually predictable business cycles that had 4 phases. The first phase is the expansion phase of the economic cycle. The second phase is the crisis phase. The third phase is the recession phase. And the fourth phase is the recovery phase. So this is really, I mean, in today's international economy, there's really nothing about this that is terribly new or, terribly sophisticated in terms of an economic business cycle model. But for Schumpeter's time, this was a pretty important kind of analysis in terms of business cycles. The reason why this is useful for us is because in 19th century America you have 4 major economic crises that turn into serious either recessions or depressions. You basically have 2 that are recessions and 2 that are depressions. And these economic crises become, uh, they have a certain kind of pattern. It seems like the American economy has to go into some sort of a crisis every 15 to 20 years. Even when you look at the smaller crises, every almost 10 years. Um, so again, this is characteristic of modern economies. So the crises that we're talking about are the 1837 panic, the 1857 panic is 20 years right on the button. Then in 1873 there's a depression, and in 1893 there's another economic downturn, which is probably the most serious of all of the economic downturns. It's a major depression with very high unemployment that lasts for about 4 years. So, okay, so let's talk first about the 1837 panic. Now, this panic takes place in America, which has very little of what we would call a modern economic infrastructure. There's no Federal Reserve moderating interest rates or injecting money into the economy. There's the, the American economy is pretty much a national economy. It's not yet an international economy. By the end of the century, it becomes more of an international economy. And so here's what happens. In 1836, the President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, actually even earlier than that, he begins to, in the 1830s, he begins to take deposits out of the American National Bank and put them in state banks. Okay, why would he do this? Okay, because he's been attacking the national banks since about 1832 when he ran for re-election. So Andrew Jackson did not like the fact that the United States had a national bank. The national bank was founded in the 1790s by Alexander Hamilton, sorry. And Hamilton believed that a strong national bank could become the basis for a strong American economy. in a kind of neo-mercantilist approach. The National Bank of the United States would and did hold the U.S. Treasury accounts. So if there was money coming in from tariffs, it went into the National Bank, and then the National Bank would loan money out for major projects like canals, railroads, infrastructure projects that required major investments in the American economy. The bank was staffed and the board of directors was mostly Northeastern financiers. In the 1820s and 30s, the head of the bank was a guy named Nicholas Biddle. And Biddle and Andrew Jackson did not get along. Jackson was a Western plantation owner from Tennessee, a slaveholder, but he had lots of connections with the West. Believed that Western farming was the key to the American economy, and that these Eastern bankers couldn't be trusted. He was also suspicious of paper money, and Jackson was definitely an economic populist. So in the 1830s, he begins to attack the National Bank. And he does this by taking out the deposits of the National Bank. He can do this as the president because, of course, he controls the Treasury. He takes these deposits and he puts them in various state banks, because most of the states of the United States in this time period also have their own state banks. This is another kind of neo-mercantilist approach where the state banks fund major projects and produce economic development by using receipts, state tax receipts, these kinds of receipts, and putting that money back into the American economy through loans. Okay. So Jackson takes the money out of the banks. Now the money is circulating more widely because it's in these state banks, and this produces inflation. So in early 1937, there's a jump up in inflation because the money supply is basically increased by Jackson's actions. And then that inflation becomes deflation when the state banks try to stem inflation by requiring that their depositors deposit money in specie, in coin only. These state banks refuse to accept paper money. Okay, now let me stop for a minute and talk about paper money in the United States in the first half of the 19th century. It's estimated that there are about 7,200 different forms of paper money in the United States in the first half of the 19th century, all told, throughout the first half of the 19th century. This is a problem. There's a lot of different kinds of paper money floating around out there. Each bank can print its own paper money and use that as an exchange maybe in the town that the bank is in, or maybe in the county if it's a bigger bank, or the region if it's an even bigger bank. So a major problem in the American economy is the circulation of all of these different forms of paper money. How do you account for the value of the different forms of paper money? And there's a real open question as to who recognizes the value of this paper money. How many silver coins is a particular piece of paper money worth? It's a mess. It's a real mess. And so in the 1837 panic, the state banks refused to take this paper money, which means basically that it's worthless, except if you can find, a merchant or somebody else who will actually take the paper money. And this means that the inflation becomes a deflation, and literally that paper money becomes useless. It gets pulled out of the economy because the banks don't recognize it, and you have a panic. Okay, and the panic, it goes from 1837 to 1839. There's still some effects of it by 1842, but in that time period, about half of all American banks are closed because of the problems that you have with the use of paper money. And then what happens is you have a run on the banks. This is very common in all of these crises. And so people run to the bank because they're worried about the bank collapsing. So they run to the bank and they pull their deposits out, which of course ensures that the bank will collapse. There is no insurance, federal deposit insurance, that protects this system either. Okay, so the recovery for this is there's a new immigration that comes in the late 1839 to about 1842. You have a new influx of Germans and especially Irish, and that produces economic activity and the economy recovers. Okay, the next major downturn is the Panic of 1857. Now, this is a panic caused by the West and the expansion to the West. And what you have with settlers going to the West and railroads building Western lines, and then you have cities going to the West, banks borrowing to railroads to build this infrastructure, you have several situations where there's overexpansion. In 1857, there's overexpansion. 1873, there's overexpansion again. Even in 1893, there's overexpansion of railroads. Okay, so you have this western frontier which is expanding to the west. Population's growing. People are buying land, doing economic activity, and the banks are speculating this will continue and continue. And when it doesn't continue, then the banks are left holding the bag. They pull their money, the railroads collapse, and then you have a panic. In the 1857 panic, you had 5 major railroads collapsed. Another one was in trouble. The northern part of the country was in deep trouble for a couple of years. And then the Civil War happened in 1861, and this really pulled the North out of this panic. But the interesting part here is that the South did not suffer a panic at all. Why? Because the South was not dependent upon bank capital. Southerners had as their capital their land and their slaves. They did some borrowing with Eastern banks, but the kind of borrowing they did was really dependent upon the cotton crop and depended upon how many slaves they had, and these were pretty constant. The cotton crop continued to be very stable in the period of the 1857 panic. It's interesting because Southerners actually argued after the panic. They said, because there was a lot of tension between the North and the South, and they were on the precipice of a civil war. Southerners argued, hey, we've got a better system here because we didn't suffer any panic at all. You Northerners, with all of this loose capital, causing all kinds of problems in the economy. Well, of course, the Civil War happened anyhow, and Northerners didn't really buy this argument. But it is one should note that there were 6 millionaires in 1860, and all of them lived in the South. Now they counted as capital their slaves and their land, and that's why you have these major wealthy people in the South, wealthier than in the North, because they have access to such large amounts of illiquid capital, land and slave labor. Okay, so that's the 1857. So the Civil War happens, the North expands, the Southern economy is really destroyed. The Southern economy has inflation of about 85 to 88% for the Civil War. The North is minimal inflation, and so the Southern economy is really struggling at the end of the Civil War, and the Northern economy is booming. Part of the reason the North succeeds is because in 1862 the North for the first time issues what we call greenbacks, the dollar bill. And they do this because the North is actually running out of currency in 1862. They can't pay their troops, they can't pay suppliers, and so the Congress says, hey, we got to do something about this, and they decide to issue greenbacks. Okay, and it essentially saves the Northern economy, because the Northern economy has this infusion of capital. The greenbacks are issued by the government. They're guaranteed as payment for all goods and services by the federal government for that time period. And so the northern economy is allowed to expand because the money supply expands at the right time. Um, and it suffers a little bit of inflation, but not nearly as badly as in the South. Okay, the next major crisis is in 1873. The Civil War is over. There's a reconstruction going on in the South. Northern entrepreneurs and banks have put a lot of money into the South. And now, in 1873, the economy begins to turn down. It begins to go into a recession, which eventually becomes a depression. And it's not so much it's the expansion is pushed forward by northern investments in the South, uh, but the contraction takes place once again because of Western overexpansion. Okay, because you have lots of investments in the West, and the there's simply there's too much expansion, too much money put into the West, and then you have this contraction. So you have a situation in the on the frontier, which is a little bit like a bubble. Okay, these over expansions happen, and then they burst, and then people lose a lot of money, and then the economy has to restart in the West. Okay, let's talk about one more economic downturn, and this is the 1893 downturn, which is a very serious economic crisis. Once again, it happens because of the Western expansion is too much. What happens in the West is you have a decline in land prices. In the 1890s, you also have a decline in crop prices. Crop prices basically collapse because of overproduction. You have corn going from about 70 cents a bushel, pardon me, to about 30 cents a bushel in this time period. Same thing with wheat. And so the saying is that uh, in Kansas we trusted, in God we trusted. In Kansas we got busted. That's what farmers who had gone west to make their fortune, and then when the economy collapsed, they lost all of their money. That's what they said. Okay, so and in this depression, this is a very serious depression with unemployment of about 20%, which lasts about 4 years. You have a new situation where the United States labor movement, unions, have appeared between 1873 and 1893. And of course, these unions are very unhappy with the downturn in the economy. They go on strike. There's labor violence. This is a brand new situation for the United States, and it's happening. This is happening in Western Europe as well. But the activities of a modern labor movement are new to the 1893 depression. Now, the other thing that causes this depression is that the Democrats take control of the executive branch, and the Democrats are connected to Western farmers. Western farmers have always wanted the United States to go on to a silver standard. You have Western farmers and you have Western silver mining companies. These two groups want the U.S. to go on a silver standard. Of course, the silver miners want to sell the silver to the government so that it can be coined. The Western farmers, why do they want silver? Because a silver standard, there's more silver than there is gold available. There's a more limited amount of gold. There's more silver. In fact, there's several Western U.S. silver mines that are very productive. And so farmers want a silver standard so that there's more access to money. The silver standard means easier money, and that means the farmers will be able to borrow at lower interest rates. It also means that there's going to be some inflation. The silver standard is typically associated with inflation. The gold standard is associated with deflation and high interest rates, silver standard with low interest rates and inflation. Now, most of Europe is on the gold standard in this time period. Most of Latin America, because of the prevalence of silver, is on the silver standard. Latin American economies tend to have more inflation and they tend to be a little more unstable. So, Eastern bankers argued, no, we stay on the gold standard. Western farmers said, no, we have to go on the silver standard. Well, Western farmers won this particular debate in 1892 in the election, and Grover Cleveland, who became the president, had promised to put more silver into the American economy. Did so, and then in 1893, the Silver Repurchase Act causes inflation. Now, inflation isn't such a bad thing, but this happened at a moment where the United States was already going into a recession. And inflation, of course, meant that prices for basic goods for farmers and for laborers were going to go up, and they went up quite a bit because of this introduction of silver into the American economy. And people started suffering, and the resulting depression, people lost their jobs, etc. Now, the silver standard issue is very important, and I think you can access some of the if you have more questions, access the documents online. Okay, one last thing. Let's talk for a moment about the Pullman Strike. This is an example of what happens in this downturn. So George Pullman, his company built Pullman cars for the railroads. Pullman cars were these cars which were sleeping cars. A very successful entrepreneur builds an entire town outside of Chicago called Pullman, Illinois. It's a company town. They have their own post office. They have their own merchants. They have their own housing for workers there. So Pullman sees himself not just as a businessman, but as a person who's designing a futuristic approach to capitalism in which the workers are supported by the entrepreneur and the company takes care of everything. Well, that worked fine when the economy was expanding, but with the overexpansion of railroads, then the railroad business basically collapses in 1892, 1893, and Pullman can't sell his cars to any of the railroads. So he has to cut wages. He raises the rents on workers just after he's cut wages. He cuts some of the work. He fires some workers, and the workers decide to go on strike. And they're joined in the strike by a major union, which is a railroad union, in the summer of 1893. And so it becomes a nationwide strike of railroad workers connected to the Pullman strike. And in July 1893, there's this big battle that takes place between Pullman, the Pullman Company, and the strikers. And eventually, the governor of Illinois has to call out what is basically the National Guard, what's called back then the militia. They come out, and there's 8 people are killed. The town of Pullman is basically destroyed. And so this kind of a corporate welfare scheme, this is one of the first examples of it. We'll see this continuing into the 20th century. Ford Motor Company is a major example of this kind of approach to capitalism in the 20th century. But I wanted you to just give you a little information on that example. Okay, I've gone a little long today, but hang in there and you'll get to the end. Okay, have a good week.